So some of the terminology I use whenever I'm evaluating cattle often relates back to the different external parts of a beef animal. And so that is posted on the Polylearn website and it will be used quite extensively. So I'd like you to take advantage of that handout so that you have a better idea of when I'm talking about certain parts of the anatomy, what they mean. And so whenever I talk about the loin and the top line, that would indicate one of the most expensive cuts of meat in a beef animal is the loin. And so we really want to evaluate the muscle shape, the muscle expressiveness along the top line, because that would be an indication of actual value from a beef quality standpoint. I'm also going to talk about the stifle muscles and particularly the width from stifle muscle to stifle muscle, and talk about the quarter and the round, which would be in the hindquarters of the animal. And so that gives another indication of muscle shape, as well as from a beef quality standpoint. That's something that's very important. When I start talking about condition, finish of an animal, what I mean by that is the relative fatness of the animal, meaning that we can start to see less of the rib structures. You really don't have any indication of the spinous processes when you evaluate an animal down their top line. That would indicate that there's enough cover or finish for an animal to be sent to harvest. There are some issues though when an animal is heavier conditioned and lacks some of that muscle shape. You start to see a lot of fat accumulate in the brisket region of the animal, which is as you watch an animal walk towards you, it's in that lower neck region right before the heart and the heart girth. And you also, when you start to evaluate fat as well, you can look at the tail head. Cattle start to deposit fat in the tail head as well. And you can also look at their overall structure of the middle portion of their body. If they have a lot more rib shape, so meaning that there's more width from side to side in terms of their overall shape, that would indicate that there's more fat tissue as well as more muscle tissue. And then when you start to evaluate fat as well, you can look at the rear flank. If that rear flank has dropped, that would indicate that there's more finish in that animal. If it's more level with their forearm and their heart girth, that would also indicate that there's more finish. You can also look at the cod in steers. This is the area of the body where an animal is castrated, so the testicles have been removed, and beef cattle that have been castrated start to deposit a lot of fat in that particular region of their body. Heifer number 8130, little high-headed, maybe has some issues with disposition, is likely a potential why she is a part of this feeder cattle class. As you study her from the profile, she's actually very long-bodied. It's got a lot of depth of body. You can see her spring of her rib structure, which would indicate that she's got some capacity and volume, particularly in terms of fat condition across that top line. Where she gives up in many ways is when you study her from behind. You start to see very little definition, very little width from stifle to stifle, and very little width as you start to study her even lower into that quarter. So when you think about muscle structure and where adipose tissue starts to develop, it starts to develop from the front to the rear and from the top down. And so that's really how you need to start evaluating cattle as you visually appraise them for muscle and fat cover. As you start to study her rear leg structure, she is the definition of cow-hocked. So she starts, as you study her hocks in particular, she hocks inward. So that's particularly a problem from a structural soundness standpoint. This is steer number 8260. So this steer a lot more muscle definition overall. He really impresses me from a rear view as you start to study him in terms of width along his top line and width from stifle to stifle. He's much more impressive than the female before him. And one thing to note is when you study him from the profile, he's still got a ton of rib shape, a lot of drop to his rear rib and flank. So what I mean by that is there's a lot more depth to that rear flank. You want his top line to be level, but you also want from the shoulder back, you want that lower portion of his body to be level as well. He's got more shape and definition to his rump. Where he starts to disappoint you is in terms of his overall structure. He's not nearly as level as you would like to see. He starts to break a little bit along his top line. And when you start to study his quarter, he doesn't nearly have as much depth to that lower portion of his quarter, which is important from a beef quality standpoint and total amount of beef product. The quarter and the round is one of the largest cuts of beef. 8260, when you start to watch him move, actually has a lot more flex to his rear hind legs than you expect, especially with the amount of muscle shape and the expressiveness of his muscle. He has a lot more muscle expression down that top line and in those hindquarters when compared to some of the other cattle in this class. This is steer 8208. You'll notice he's quite distinctive because he's got a lot more red in his hide color. This could either be due to a nutritional deficiency, or in many cases it could actually be due to breed type. So the cattle at Cal Poly are primarily crossbred Angus cattle, either Angus and Simmental or Angus and potentially another breed, but a predominantly Angus-based herd, but we will see quite a bit of red hide color in some of our feeder cattle. So you'll notice right away with 8208 is that he's a lot lighter conditioned than the other cattle in the class. He really does not impress you nearly as much in terms of his muscle shape and his hindquarters, particularly as you study him lower into his quarter. He really gives up in terms of muscle shape and muscle expression, and especially when you study him down his top line, not nearly as impressive with his overall muscle shape. Then when you study him from a profile, you really notice that he gives up in particular with that rib shape in that rear rib and flank, so not carrying that adipose tissue deposition nearly to the degree that some of the other cattle in the class are, meaning he's not ready for harvest when compared to some of the other cattle in the class. This is heifer 8193. She is also a heifer that you notice she's still got a little red in her hide color. One thing that really jumps out at me from the very beginning is that she's probably one of the heavier conditioned animals in this group, indicating that she's receiving enough feed, she's likely ready for harvest, but what she really gives up is overall muscle shape. So she's one of the lighter muscled animals in the group. As you study her, particularly from her hindquarters, she really does not have as much width from hooks to pins and stifle to stifle. She really gives up in terms of that muscle expressiveness as you evaluate her and study her down her top line and in her lower portion of her quarter. So that's something that is an indication of very little muscle expression. So when I start to place the final placings for this particular group of feeder cattle, one thing to mention is that heifers in a way are at a disadvantage already. Just based on biology, they typically do not have nearly as much muscle and growth potential as their male counterparts, their steers. And so I'm going to start the group, the top two placings, with the two steers. I think 8260 to me is the most impressive, followed by 8208. And then I would wrap up the class with 8193 and 8130. The two heifers in the class are by no means terrible in terms of total overall conformation, but they just give up in terms of muscle shape and expression. I will say that in terms of condition, 8130 to me is a little bit more appropriate in terms of her level of condition when compared to 8208 in second place. And 8130 has a good relative amount of condition, just does not have the muscle shape to move up higher in this class. She's really beautiful from the profile, but she's one of the smallest, the lightest muscled animals in this group and can go no higher in this group of feeder cattle.